If you will, be turning in your Bibles, Numbers chapter 11. We're beginning a series of studies from that book this morning. As we begin, I want to share you this story I found online. And again, this is in no way am I promoting this religion, but I think this illustration is going to help us see where we're going today. Monk joined a monastery and took a vow of silence. After the first 10 years, his superior called him in and asked, "Do you have anything to say?" The monk replied, "Food, bad." After another 10 years, the monk again had opportunity to voice his thoughts. He said, "Bed, hard." Another 10 years went by, and again he was called in before his superior. When asked if he had anything to say, he responded, "I quit." His superior replied, "It doesn't surprise me a bit. You've done nothing but complain ever since you got here." As human beings, I would suggest that one of the most amazing abilities that we have is to complain about anything and everything. You ever found yourself just sitting around thinking, just even in your mind complaining about things? I've been there, done that. Because even as God's own people today, as Christians, we can and often do have problems with complaining. Now, we understand we can and do have reasons to complain and for complaining, but I would also suggest that many times we complain for no good reason without cause. If you were to sum up the early history of Old Testament Israel with one word, how would you summarize Israel? Never satisfied, Sister Nana. In other words, they were what? Complainers. What did you say, Dusty? Selfish. And really, isn't that where a lot of complaining starts from, is the root of selfishness? But they were complainers, and it seems like almost every time we read of Israel after their deliverance from Egypt, they were doing what? Complaining about something. And it's not surprising then, as we begin our study in the book of Numbers today, that once again we find Israel complaining. Now the question we want to explore is, what does their complaining lead to? And what does it reveal about them, and conversely about us today? And so, as we look at this event, we're going to show, I think, in our study this morning that complaining is contagious. Because we're going to see how it affected Moses, but also that it is a worthless endeavor and that it really gets us nowhere. And in fact, it stalls our spiritual growth and it stalls our progression in our spiritual life. It leaves us stuck in neutral, and ultimately it can result in unbelief if we're not careful. So with these thoughts in mind, let's turn to Numbers 11. And as we begin, if someone would, read verses 1 through 3. And this takes in the first section. I've broken it down into two parts. Verses 1 through 10, we have the complaining from the people. Then verses 11 through 15, we're going to have complaining from Moses. But as we begin, someone would read verses 1 through 3 for us.
Now when the people complained, it displeased the Lord. When the Lord heard it, his anger was aroused. So the fire of the Lord burned among them, consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. Then the people cried out to Moses. When Moses prayed to the Lord, the fire was quenched. So he called the name of the place Taberah, because the fire of the Lord had burned among them.
There's a lot we can learn from this section, especially from verse number 1. Thank you, Brother Larry. And again, you go back to chapter 10, and this all begins 3 months after leaving Egypt. They arrived at Mount Sinai. And we know this from Exodus 19, verse 1. And we know from Numbers 10 and verse 11 that they were at Mount Sinai for over a year. And the complaining begins after they had been gone from Sinai a mere 3 days. So it doesn't take them long to get the complaining started now, does it? And interestingly enough, you go back to Exodus 15 when Israel came to Marah after the deliverance at the Red Sea. Israel complained on that occasion as well. And we've alluded to that, and of course several other occasions. Now, the complaining here in verse 1, the King James Version, and really the New King James as well, is vague about the complainers here in their character. The ESV translated, the people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes.
Complainer might be reduced some if there wasn't so much judging going on.
What's that?
Complainer might be reduced if there wasn't so much judgment going on. Me judging you saying you might be wrong on something or something like that. That's complaining.
That's negotiation. You have to negotiate.
Okay.
I thought he was talking about me.
Well, here what we have here is, I guess, could we say the Israelites were in just self-pity? Or not wanting to do what God wanted them to do? Not wanting to go where God wanted them to go? So they're complaining about what they considered their misfortunes. The CEV translated, they started complaining about their troubles. When we have troubles, what's the first thing we often do? Complain. And so we see that with Israel. So man's disposition basically hasn't changed. The LEB translates that, renders it, the people were like those who complain of hardship in the hearing of Jehovah. In other translations, such as the ISV, renders it complaining about their distress. And it appears from studying these other translations in preparing this lesson, it appears that they were complaining about the comforts they had left behind previously in Egypt and now at Sinai. Think about this. They were at Sinai for over a year. So do you think they had gotten settled down into a routine, I guess, of everyday living?
I'm sure they did.
And so what happens when Moses comes down? What does God tell Israel to do? Get up and move. And again, remember, was Sinai their permanent home? No, where were they on their way to? Where was God taking them? To Canaan, promised land. And yet, what do we have on the part of Israel here? Does this a mindset of, I want to go where God is going to lead me? Or is it, I just want to do my own thing? They rebelled yet again. They wanted to do what they wanted to do. What's that?
They've been kicking and screaming all the way. They didn't want to go.
Yeah, that would be an accurate, in our modern day language, Dusty, that would be an apt description of Israel. God and I guess you could say he dragged them kicking and screaming out of Egypt. We don't want to go.
They murmured against the Lord, that's the wrong thing to start with.
And again, and what makes it worse, Ricky, is they constantly did this. It wasn't just a one-time thing. This was like an ongoing thing throughout the wilderness journeys, was it not?
Instead of praying and complaining.
Yeah, and again, that's one lesson we can learn. When we need to do more praying and less complaining, I guess, was the point we need to recognize.
They were so crazy. They had the presence of the Lord there. They knew it. We do what we do by faith that He's with us. They had proof. They had living presence that He was there. And they just disregarded that. They just murmured anyway.
And they were free. That's what I'm saying.
Exactly.
And appreciation, and they lost sight of what had happened to them. They'd forgotten their past.
Mm-hmm. And they were ungrateful too for all God had done for them thus far. And isn't it funny, as soon as they get free, they suddenly forgot about what was happening to them in Egypt?
Well, if things are going good in our life, we don't forget God sometimes.
Yeah. Indeed, when we got everything going our way, the tendency on man, especially in our nation, as we've talked about before, is we don't need God. I don't want God's way in my life. We can just do things our own way. But yet when times get difficult, hey, that's when we need God.
And when we get tired, personally, I'm more prone, and I need to say, cut it off, stop, and rest, and catch lessons. I think they've been there long, they were tired, they were weary, and they just lost sight of their goals. And I sound like I'm defending them, I'm not. I'm just saying, from a personal point of view, I can understand some of the I'm not trying to take up because they were wrong, they've forgotten. And to me, that would have been an appropriate time to count the blessings.
Right. That's when we count our blessings, is when in the most difficult or trying of
And
circumstances.
then we avoid self-pity.
You know, we need to do, as we often sing, count your many blessings, see what God hath done. And there's another line in the song, and it will surprise you what the Lord hath done. You know, and I think we need to step back on occasion and do that, do we not? Instead of complaining, we need to pray and we need to step back and see just how much God has blessed us. And Israel should have done that. Look where they should have remembered the misery they experienced in Egypt. And indeed, it was a miserable life, was it not? Now, was life in the wilderness the easiest? Absolutely not. But again, look who was with them. God. He guided them in a pillar of in a walk by day and a walk by night. There you go. So they had the presence of God, but they didn't trust Him. So they complained. So what does God do here? He hears this complaining, and what's his reaction? What is God's reaction? He is angry. So what does this tell us about God, the nature of God now? Yeah, He can be angry. And a lot of people forget this. He is angry here. He saw and heard their complaining. So what does He do? He sent fire on them. Now notice this, it wasn't on the majority of the camp, it was in the outskirts or the outer parts of the camp. And so what did Israel do now? When this occurred, how did Israel respond according to verse 2? Well, they finally did something right. They cried unto Moses, and then Moses did what? He prayed. Moses prayed. Now it is ironic here that they cry unto Moses to do something, because when you study their history, who else do they murmur against as well? Not just God, but Moses. So it's ironic here they're crying out to Moses, do something. Help us. When on other occasions they're murmuring, they're complaining against Him like they do against God. And so Moses prays unto God, and how does God respond to Moses' prayer? He quenches the fire. So what does this tell us today about prayer? He answers prayer. God hears the prayer of His children, and He answers it. And again, we cannot help but be reminded of that basic passage in James, are we not? The effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man does what? And here we have the effectual fervent prayer of who? Moses, a righteous man. And it did avail much, because God answered it positively in stopping that fire. Moses interceded for Israel. And so God put an end to that. Verse 3 really is historical information given regarding the name of this particular location and why it was named thusly. And it served to warn that grumbling and complaining against God has severe consequences. However, this isn't the end of their complaining. Let's look at verses 4 through 10. If someone would, read these verses for us. Because they start their complaining up yet again.
And the next multitude that was among them fell lusty, and the children of Israel also left the camp and said, who shall give us fish to eat? We remember the fish which we did in Egypt freely, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, and the onions, and the garlic. But now our soul is dried away. There is nothing at all besides the manna before our eyes. What did you say?
Verse 10.
Oh, okay. And the manna was as cotton seed, and the color thereof, the color is in the
Bdellium.
And the people ground it in the mills and beat it into a mortar, and make it in pans and make cakes of it. And the taste of it was as to the taste of fresh oil. And when they grew near, when the dew fell upon the camp in the night, the manna fell on it. And Moses heard the people about their families,
All right. Thank you, Sister Nina. All right. So here we see them complaining once again. This time about what? About their food. Now, notice they're weeping. Verse 4, you have an interesting phrase here, mixed multitude. Now, it should be, among the Israelites, there were those who had lived in Egypt who left along with them. That is, there were non-Israelites here. And as to why these accompanied the Israelites, we do not know, but we do know from this verse some did. The English Standard Version refers to these individuals as the rabble. Now, I like the International Standard. When I studied this, it renders this as certain riffraff. And when you think about that term riffraff, what comes to mind? Yeah. And what's that, Sister? No? Mm-hmm. Well, that's true too. However, along with the Israelites, they began to lust for that which had not been provided. And so they complained about a lack of flesh to eat. And this implied God nor Moses could imply them with such. Now, what did they want to do, according to verse 5? What did they long for? They longed for Egypt. Now, I like what our book says. If you notice on page 14 of the book, I like what it offers here. And I've got it in my notes, the actual quote. It says that Israel returned to Egypt in heart. Now, they weren't actually in Egypt, we know that, but had they returned to Egypt in a sense? In their minds. They forgot, again, as we've noted, they forgot the slavery, the oppression, and the idolatry. But what did they remember? They remembered the good stuff. And they forgot all about the bad stuff. And again, isn't that what sin does? Deceives? People forget when people choose the lifestyle of sin, or they choose as Christians to return to a lifestyle of sin, they choose to remember what about their former manner of life? The good times, not the bad. And so bondage to Egypt really serves as a shadow of man's bondage to sin in many ways. And we can't remember, we can't go back to that life. Israel should never have longed for Egypt again, should they? Because God had something far better that awaited for them. The land of Canaan, the promised land. And yet here we see Israel just not trusting God, not believing God, wanting to go back to the old way of life rather than continuing in the new. Now look at verses 6 through 9. Look at verse number 6. When you look at the phrase, they say our soul is dried away, there's nothing at all beside this manna. When you read that, do you not get does that statement not ooze with contempt? Is Israel showing contempt for what God provided for them with that statement? But they want more. They weren't counting their blessings. And they weren't grateful. And again, remember, what did God promise Israel when He brought them out? That He would be what? Yeah. Land flowing with milk and honey. And remember, the promises of God cannot fail. And yet Israel, not trusting God, not trusting the one who delivered them from their bondage. And so, what is the reaction yet again of God in Moses, verse number 10? Angry. It was their displeasure and discontent was not hidden, wasn't hidden from Moses. nor was it hidden from God. And again, God is angry again, notice this, the anger of the Lord was kindled how? There's one little word there that tells us how angry God was with his people. Greatly aroused.
That means a lot.
What's that, Sister Nana?
It means a lot. He was very angry.
Very angry.
Very.
Yeah, that describes how angry he was. And again, a lot of people don't like to read this, do they, about God? They don't. They just like to think of God as a loving God, and indeed He is. But again, we see another side to his character. He can be angered. Question: do you think what he sees in our nation today, all the complaining, all the immorality taking place, do you think God is angry?
Most definitely.
Indeed, He is. But we also understand that He is long-suffering with us, with mankind. He gives man opportunity to change, to get his life right. But again, that long-suffering is only going to last so long, and as it did with Israel. And certainly we see the long-suffering of God with Israel, do we not? When He sent the fire in the camp here in verse number 1, what could He have done? He could have destroyed them all. But what happened? He spared them, thanks to Moses, who interceded on their behalf, prayed to God. And here again, He grows angry with them. Now, what could He have done here? He could have destroyed them in the blink of an eye. But again, we're going to see He does not. And again, that's long-suffering. Even though God is angry with them, He is still long-suffering. But it's up to man to take advantage of the long-suffering of God. However, though, as we find out from this verse, yes, Moses was angry, but in his displeasure, this leads Moses to become so frustrated with things that he himself begins to do what? Be displeased. And what does he do when he turns to God now, according to verses 11 through 15? What's he going to do? Yeah, he's going to do some complaining, is he not? And if someone would, let's read these verses 11 through 15.
Moses said unto the Lord, wherefore hast thou afflicted thy servant? And wherefore have I not found favor in thy sight, that thou layest the burden of all this people upon me? Have I conceived all these people? Have I forgotten them, that thou shouldest say unto me, carry them in thy bosom as a nursing father bearing a suckling child, unto the land which thou swearest unto their fathers? Whence should I have flesh to give unto all this people? For they weep unto me, saying, give us flesh that we may eat. I am not able to bear all this people alone, because it is too heavy for me. And if thou hast dealt thus with me, kill me, I pray thee, out of thy hand, if I have found favor in thy sight, and that thee not see my riches.
Thank you, Sister Dusty. And again, I guess, I label this complaining from Moses, but is this not a little indulging in self-pity on his part here? And we can see why Moses would be so frustrated, can we not? We can see why Moses would get to this point. Notice his frustration here in verse number 11. What question does he ask God? What does he think God has done to him? Forsaken him. Why hast thou afflicted me? And again, he's just looking at his situation. He's looking at what's going on. He's looking at the ingratitude of Israel as well. And remember, what was Moses' responsibility at this time? He was leading the God's people into the promised land at this time. A tremendous responsibility, was it not?
That's what I was coming from. I can understand him too. His frustration when you raise your family and they don't turn out like you want.
You can't, yeah.
And you feel like, well, where did I fail? I'm sure Moses had all of those ideas.
We can justify some of Moses' frustration is justifiable. Because as Christians today, we can get frustrated. Yeah. And look at look at look at what he thought here in verse number 11. Moses thought he hadn't found what? Favor in God's sight. Now, why would Moses think that? Why would Moses think he hadn't found favor in God's sight? Because of all that's gone on. And so, even in his frustration, I think we're seeing Moses really get some things confused, though, in this frustration. Because you look at his feelings here, and you're going to see he had not gave birth to the nation. He properly recognized that God did. Yet he felt himself had to bear the burden of attending to them and leading them by himself. Now, could we say here that Moses was guilty of leaving God out of the equation and saying that? Indeed. All the while he is speaking to God out of his frustration here, but yet he is saying, I've done this, I'm having to deal with this. When he should have recognized properly that it was God to do that. And so, verse 14, Moses really is weary. And so he says, I'm not able to bear all this people alone. In other words, what is Moses wanting to do? We talked about this a couple of Sunday mornings ago in our sermon with Elijah. And I think we're seeing a little bit of that here as well. What does Moses want to do here? Well, he's saying that. And that's a cry. It's a cry for help. But he's also saying, I think, I just give up. I can't do this anymore. But as we're going to see, God acknowledges this as a cry for help, as next week we'll point out. But Moses, would we not say that Moses is just really fed up with everything here? Fed up with the complaining of the Israelites, the ingratitude of the Israelites? Begging for help.
In the previous verse we read, is where you lay this burden on me.
Yeah.
And he's feeling just not like a faith. Moses was too great.
He's just feeling rotten. He's just feeling discouraged and depressed.
He was saying, God, you lay this burden on me. I need some help.
Well, it's sort of like what Elijah felt. Remember 1 Kings 19 where he felt like he was alone? And then again, we can parallel that back here to Moses. Moses felt like he was alone and having to bear this burden.
Well, he was, because later we learned that God has him appoint elders, or not elders, but men that would deal with these problems and just bring certain, the ones they couldn't solve themselves, to Moses, so we didn't have to put up with all.
Yeah, and that's going to be the solution God offers. I think, though, Moses here expresses a great truth, does he not? I cannot bear this people alone. And I think that expresses a great truth that without God, we cannot bear life's burdens, can we? That is a profound truth Moses is expressing here.
God will give up one time or another.
Yeah. We all have. Because what we have here, Moses is expressing his own insufficiency, his inadequacy. And certainly, too, we must. I cannot make it in this life alone. I'm not able to just direct my own steps properly. I need God. I need His Word. And we do that by submitting our lives to God. And you think about His Word. Does His Word equip us to deal with the burdens of life? Indeed it does. Paul told the Galatians, every man shall bear his own burden. And how can we bear them if we don't know how to bear them? And that's where the Word of God comes in, and that's where prayer comes in, I would suggest.
Today, we don't meet once a month, just one man making a decision.
Right.
That's what we discuss. No one has all answers. Just like when they first cried out earlier, wanting deacon, people take care of that situation. So all needs to involve the elders, if you got elders, and have elders. That's wonderful. That's scripture.
Mm-hmm.
You haven't got them, you
Exactly.
And I think that probably the group of people meet here, 5 or 6 men, we're not the elders, but we discuss what will be best for God.
Mm-hmm. The key thing in any area of life, especially among Christians, is allowing God to govern. Basing decisions on the Word of God. And that's how we live our lives as Christians, do we not? We choose to serve God based on what God has said in His Word, based on His promises. You know, and that's how spiritual success comes, is it not? For anyone. It's to make decisions based on God, to turn to God for the guidance in making decisions. And that's exactly what Moses does here, is it not? And I think that's the reason why God is... You look at verses 16 and following, which we'll get into next week, Lord willing. Does God chastise Moses? Does God rebuke Moses for what he says here? No. God gives the solution to the problem. And so God listened to Moses describe the problem, and He's going to help Moses by giving the solution. And I think that's important to note as well. So even though Moses is feeling so overwhelmed, and indeed he is overwhelmed, verse 15, that his desire is for God to simply kill him. You know, just put me out of my misery, to be cast out of God's sight. But God knew Moses was a faithful servant of His, did He not? And God listened to his frustrations.
He knows his heart.
He knows his heart. Again, you go back to 1 Kings 19 as well. Elijah. Did God rebuke Elijah when he grew so discouraged like Moses did? No. He gave him an assignment, and he also told him there are still 7,000 in Israel that have not bowed their knee to Baal. And I found this, and as I studied this, I found that a lot of parallels between the two accounts, between Elijah there and Moses here. I found it very interesting. And how Moses grew so frustrated just out of the complaining of the people, whereas Elijah was frustrated and defeated because people weren't turning back to God, and that he was viewed as a troublemaker.
You used a word that was very appropriate. He was overwhelmed.
Yeah,
He was very
overwhelmed. And life can be overwhelming, can it not? When, you know, the hustle and bustle of life can overwhelm us all. And when life seems overwhelming, when the things of this life seem to be pressing in on every hand, what should our response be as children of God?
Turn to God.
Turn to God. Exactly.
Help me do the right thing.
Pray and lean upon God.
And I just ask for help me do the right thing.
Yeah, and we don't turn away from God. We turn closer to God. You know, in everything, in every part of our life, we should rely upon God. But especially in the difficult times. I believe if we rely upon God in the good times, that's going to enable us to rely upon Him in the most difficult of times. So how do we get to the point where we rely upon God in all times of life? Study. We grow.
We can go back to Scripture, be angry. It wasn't in anger at one time or another.
Yeah.
But sin not. That's where we need to know what the Word says.
Right. Be ye angry and sin not. Even Christ was angry, was He not, from time to time? But He did not sin in His anger. How many times have you and I sinned in our anger? I've sinned in my anger. I think we've all, and that's the challenge.
I don't think Moses was sinning.
No.
I just like your word that you used.
He was overwhelmed here.
And he needed help.
Now, if you're familiar with the book of Numbers, you know there's going to come an account here, and it's going to come later in this study, where Moses does get angry, and he does sin in his anger. And that kept him out of the promised land.
Yeah, that wasn't really that.
But I think it's interesting to note that, we have these accounts of Elijah and Moses, that even the most faithful, even those with the strongest of faith in God can become overwhelmed. And I think it reminds us, I hope it reminds us all, and it reminds me that, even when you're faithful to God, you're still human. You still feel human emotions. And you're still subject to them. You're still subject to the frailties of life, and you're still subject to the emotions that we have as human beings. And that's what we need to, and that's just the fact of the matter. And so really in this lesson we've noted that what complaining brought to Israel, nothing good. And we also noted what frustration brought to Moses. He poured out his complaints unto God. However, the difference between Israel and Moses was Moses poured out his complaints to the right source. And that's what we need to do as Christians today. I think there's 4 keys that I want to give you as we close this lesson, as we close our discussion, to help us in all of this, to help us in our life, to help strengthen our faith in God. Number 1, we need to continue to realize God is there and that He cares, do we not? 1 Peter 5, verse 7, God tells us to do what? Well, why does He want us to cast our cares upon Him? For He cares for us. He sees our difficulties, and He knows that what we go through. And we need to accept this fact, and we need to recognize God is in control. And ultimately, we know how things are going to turn out. If God be for us, who can be against us? We'll be victorious. But key number 2, we need to recognize, as we've talked about, just how abundantly God has blessed us. And we need to stop and count our blessings no matter how bad things may seem to be in this life. And we're going to be amazed at what God has done. And that's what Israel should have done when they started their complaining, was count their blessings. Look where they were now. Look where they were in Egypt. And have been thankful for where they were now instead of where they were then. We need to recognize that even with God on our side, and this is number 3, we've never been promised a smooth ride in this life, have we? Borrowing from the words of the old song, Christ and God never promised us a rose garden, did they? There's going to be a little bit of rain sometimes in our life. So we will face challenges and difficulties to overcome, just as Moses found out here in this text. But above all, we need to remember the promise of God to never leave us nor to forsake us. Hebrews 13, verse 5. And we need to lean upon He who is the one who is faithful in all that He promises. And I think that's what we see with Moses. Even though Moses was frustrated, even though he was engaging in perhaps self-pity, and even though he was complaining, the key point is he turned to the right source. He poured out his feelings unto God. And that's what you and I as Christians need to do. We need to rely upon God. And we need to let God know how we are feeling. And we do that through the avenue of prayer.